A couple of weeks ago, the 2025 Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to Joel Mokyr, an economic historian at Northwestern University, Philippe Aghion, affiliated with universities in France as well as the UK, and Peter Howitt, a professor of economics at Brown University. Now, the three of them didn't work together, but there are some themes that connect their work. Now, that said, Philippe Aghion and Peter Howitt did work together. They developed a model that made it possible to understand growth, but not just any growth, the growth fueled by creative destruction. Now, if growth associated with destruction doesn't sound concerning, I'll add one more fact for you to think about. Creative destruction was first described by Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter in 1942, and it was in response to ideas that he got from Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. In fact, Marx thought, and Schumpeter agreed, that it would lead to the end of capitalism. They just didn't agree about why. And so in this week's episode of Art of Supply, I will describe what creative destruction means and why it is no ordinary form of business or economic growth, as well as how that idea is connected to the potential end of capitalism. And then finally, we'll think about why it is so fascinating that this idea is being highlighted at this moment in time with the rise of AI playing out right before our eyes. Now, Aghion and Howitt didn't invent creative destruction, but what they did is create a mathematical model that helps explain how innovation can benefit the economy as a whole, even as it harms some existing businesses. They first published the model in 1992, so it took 33 years for them to earn this recognition. As you might expect, with a name like creative destruction, we're not talking about incremental change. We're talking about massive leaps forward, leaps that will leave some people and organizations behind. Now, the interesting thing is, the faster the rate of creative destruction gives us a faster rate of innovation and progress, but also destruction that is more destructive. So there's sort of a good news, bad news, or at least a good news for some people, bad news for other people, dimension to all of this. When Joseph Schumpeter first used the phrase creative destruction theory in 1942, he was referring to the process of innovation dismantling or disrupting long-standing economic structures in the way to make room for new ones. He described it as the, quote, process of industrial mutation that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. Now, this theory accepts and even encourages, although Schumpeter didn't necessarily come out and say that he thought creative destruction was good. He simply said it was a real dynamic. But in order to work, it has to accept the idea that competition will lead to some companies failing. And the idea is that that failure must happen in order to make way for the next wave of growth by reprioritizing and realigning scarce resources. Creative destruction prioritizes a long-term view versus a short-term perspective on growth. And it's in contrast to economic theories that aim to achieve equilibrium, even in the process of getting growth and innovation. So if you think about the classic idea of supply and demand, you have those nice waves, right, that play well together and eventually meet somewhere in the middle. That is not the idea behind creative destruction. It creates winners and losers, and it can be harsh and move fast. Every new idea that comes into the framework has to beat out the old established things in order to start building its own advantage. Now, one other interesting distinction I found in my reading is that, yes, we're looking at innovation and its effects on existing markets, but it's not the same thing as invention. Now, as I was going through and doing my research, I always love to come across familiar names and friends, and I found a great piece that Kate Fatasic wrote for Forbes. And in it, she addressed this point of how innovation and invention are different. Now, they both lead to new things, potentially great things. But the major difference is that innovation is led by business leaders, and they're in a position to take a product or service to market, as opposed to, I don't know, the absent minded professor who's tinkering in a shed or a basement and maybe invents the best thing ever, but doesn't have the ability or the interest to bring that to market at scale. In order to count as innovation, we have to be looking at something that's made available to the public. Now, as we've got things rising and other things falling, we come around to this idea of churn. So, unlike supply and demand that are supposed to reach their point of equilibrium, with creative destruction, we have a lot of uncertainty. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is where the Nobel Prize winning model comes in, is that it really depends on how far away you're looking at the market conditions from. So, in some cases, you could look at an industry or a group of companies, and everything looks pretty stable on the surface. But once you drill down into the details, you can see that absolutely nothing is holding still. I think the best analogy for this is people will sometimes talk about a duck on a pond. Above the water, it's all calmness and duckiness and floating. But underneath the water, those little feet are going with everything they have in them. And I realize that is a gross oversimplification, but I think it's the same kind of idea that Aghion and Howitt were able to model out. What they're saying is that we get this surface level appearance of stability because small gains and losses are canceling each other out, but it's all still part of the creative cycle. Now, the interesting thing is, this means we are already and we are always living in the midst of creative destruction. We may just not realize it. So the model itself may not be fully stable, but according to Aghion and Howitt, it can achieve general equilibrium, especially over time. The other thing they found in their research is that you actually have to bring multiple different markets together into one model to get that balancing and canceling out. So for instance, if you just look at R&D spending, things might look pretty chaotic. But if you also factor in trends in household spending, you might see the system start to reach equilibrium, even without being stable. Now, if we look at some of the statistics that go along with this idea of churn, in the United States, 10% of all businesses go bankrupt every year. Now, they're not all the same size. If the Chinese restaurant down the street from you goes out of business and Panera expands and opens 20 new locations somewhere on the West Coast, you personally are not going to see those things cancel out. But in the bigger economic sense, the dynamics that go along with that actually have a way of being coordinated. Creative destruction presumes, in a way, that the companies that go bankrupt weren't viable. And so, therefore, they should go bankrupt because they're consuming resources that might otherwise give companies that have a better chance, or at least a new chance, to be successful, to use those resources in order to grow. And this dynamic of constantly rising and falling incentivizes companies to invest in R&D. Their ultimate goal is to get to the top of the competitive pile, because at the top of the pile, not only are you dominating your market, but you are more profitable for the same amount of work and effort as your competitors are. In fact, creative destruction has been described as a way to innovate yourself away from competitive pressure. One of the articles that I read in the Financial Times said that, quote, innovators are motivated by the possibility of lucrative monopoly. Now, that's an interesting thing to say because we know typically economies and industries and systems are trying to stay away from monopoly. But from a business leader's perspective or an entrepreneur's perspective, everybody wants to get to that place on the pile where you have the advantage to defend, not because you're looking for stress or excitement, but because it means you can charge more than anybody else And then that means you have more resources to come up with new innovations, enter new markets, all the different things that lead to growth. Now, I've talked about the fact that this is something that takes place over time. Here's a really interesting fact that I got from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. The unemployment rate in the United States in 1776 isn't actually that different from what we see today. But if we look at it differently, living standards have increased about 30 times over that same window. The Competitive Enterprise Institute wrote, quote, "It is not the number of jobs that matters for living standards so much as what value those jobs create." So isn't that interesting? The year that the Declaration of Independence was signed had about the same unemployment rate that we have now in 2025 with AI. There are two other interesting dynamics described in the Nobel Prize winning work, and both of them have the concepts of evolution and development over time baked into them. The first one is that all technology, yes, even the old stuff, still has value to society and economies because that is what allows the next generation of innovation to happen. Every single new innovation sits on the innovation of old. And we can look at something like, I don't know, MS-DOS and say, well, that looks very old-fashioned. But we wouldn't be building agentic AI and automation today if that former step of innovation hadn't happened. The second dynamic kind of brings us back to this profitability piece. So a company that manages to outcompete an older company and push them off the top of the ladder or the top of the pile can charge disproportionately more for their product or service because it's new, and therefore they can get larger profit margins. Now, even with all of this, it's not to say that all destruction or as much destruction as you want is necessarily a good thing. The concentration of companies competing in one space can be too high and it can be too low. And both of those are bad for innovation. So there is an optimal level of concentration in any given market that has to be present for this to work. Now, the interesting thing is, especially over the last few years, we're used to seeing companies come into business and go out of business, and we've sort of gotten used to this cycle of rising and falling. But both Joseph Schumpeter and Karl Marx, for different reasons, believed that creative destruction would ultimately lead to the end of capitalism. Now, they believe this for very different reasons. Karl Marx believed that capitalism would ultimately be destroyed when working class people had had enough, and they finally rose up in revolt against the business class. Schumpeter took a very different view. He believed that capitalism could only be destroyed from within. So, for instance, if the companies that became strong enough to get to the top of the pile and dominate their market and generate the most profitability, they could get to the point where they would have enough influence to block out new entrants, and it would end the cycle of rising and falling, and therefore innovation. In Schumpeter's book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, and I was reading the third edition, which came out in 1950, he argued that, quote, not only is capitalism never stationary, but it can't be. He talks about the growth that is fueled because people want new stuff. Apparently, this is a universal dynamic. When they see something new and interesting, they're willing to pay for it. And that revenue, in turn, drives further progress for other companies competing to get a piece of that market. Schumpeter says we shouldn't look at how capitalism is producing things, even good things. We should look at what it is destroying and how. And it's interesting because this word destruction is really intense. He's not talking about margin erosion or companies splitting differently the demand in an industry. It is literally a solution that comes up and challenges the existential foundation of another company. Now, it's interesting. I think one of the examples I read several times is sort of this idea of Blockbuster Video and Netflix. Hopefully, I'm not dating myself too much with that example. But the idea that People always went to Blockbuster to physically browse and take home with them first a VHS tape and then a DVD so they could watch a movie. And Netflix changed that not by having bigger stores or brighter stores or stores that also had video games and snacks, but by saying, you don't need to leave your house. You can make a list in a website. And as soon as you have an open capacity on your plan, we will just send you the next disc. Netflix completely disrupted the way we got access to video content. Now, it's interesting too because sometimes with these large players, they may be trying to defend their advantage. But there are also other institutions that might try to step in and ensure stability in economy and society by preventing too much change from happening. Now, regardless of whether it's company driven or whether it's maybe the federal government intervening to protect industries or businesses in the United States, Schumpeter did worry that corporatism, this idea that really big companies could get such a competitive advantage that no one could challenge them, he was concerned that that was what was going to end the cycle of creative destruction. In the end, this process of creative destruction benefits the society as a whole because goods become better, they become less expensive, and worker standards of living increase. Now, that doesn't mean that standards of living increase for everybody, especially in the short term. Some of these changes are enough that some people are going to be put out of work. They may have to go through retraining programs. They may have to change their life plan. The reality is, whether it's on an individual level or a corporate level, there are people that in specific instances are not interested in the benefits of creative destruction. And in fact, to quote that Financial Times article I read, they said, quote, innovation threatens incumbents who will fight to repress it. But this is all part of the dynamic. So now that we've had this opportunity to learn more about creative destruction and how it works, I always ask myself, what are we supposed to do with this information? Well, we start by not taking the system and the benefits that it generates for granted. It was interesting because back in 2021, the Financial Times did a book review on the power of creative destruction, which was written in part by Philippe Aghion and a couple of other authors. They described it as, quote, rather dry, which I found ironic because honestly, the Financial Times can be rather dry. So if they think it's dry, it's a very academic book. But they do make some really interesting points. One of the things that they point to is the importance of following the money. So, for example, the United States has both venture capital, which gives businesses critical early cash when they need it in their growth cycle, as well as institutional investors that are likely to support less risky, but slightly less profitable investments like you would see in the stock market. So you get both the early cash infusion you need to stimulate growth, and then also the ongoing investment required to allow growth to continue. Consumers play an important part in this as well. They always want something new. And so for consumers, there is a ton of power in that system. The investment structure continues to fund the churn, but some research think that they see signs that this dynamic is slowing. Michael Peters is an associate professor of economics at Yale University, and he's looking at market entry rates as well as the frequency of individual job-to-job transitions. That both of these are proxies for business dynamism, as he describes it, and he thinks both have been falling over the last decade. As he wrote, quote, the share of the US economy dominated by the top 1% of companies by assets has risen above 90%, compared with 70% in the 1930s. He thinks that access to cash, trade protectionism, and some other dynamics have made it possible for big, weak businesses to stay operating longer than they otherwise would. Now, as I've talked about, that pulls all the oxygen out of the room. It takes funding and people and creativity away from little businesses that theoretically deserve a piece of that market. So it will be interesting to see, especially considering the last 10 years do include the disruption of COVID, if that's a dynamic that continues, or if some of the newer things we're seeing in business now shake that up and increase the rate of business dynamism. One of the articles I read about that Nobel Award, this one was on science.org, it points out that governments getting involved in industries to keep certain companies and businesses alive hurts the process of creative destruction. So there's some tension in there because we don't want complete upheaval, and we are concerned about the individuals that will be displaced when change happens. That article stresses that it's important to support the worker, not the job. That is part of why I think we need to remember that creative destruction finds its roots in Marx's Communist Manifesto. The impact that we are seeing from AI today is a perfect example of creative destruction. Jobs are going away, companies and segments of industries may follow, or at least change enough that they're not recognizable anymore. We have to remember that every moment in business and industry has a past and a future. It's built on the solutions that went away, but ultimately the innovations that we're seeing today will give way in some form to the solutions yet to come. Now, that could be whatever the next AI is going to be, built on the AI of today. Or it could be the AI of today being absorbed sort of at the foundation level of future technologies. In Schumpeter's book that I referenced, he talks about the fact that creative destruction can best be seen over time, which is pretty crazy if you think about how much creative destruction we're seeing today. We are literally watching everything morph right in front of our eyes. Kind of makes you wonder how it's going to look back when we view 2025, 2024, 2026, 5 or 10 years in the future. So given all of this, here's what I think we need to take away. When people and companies, industries and institutions value cooperation and innovation, they work to enrich themselves. And even if they're only benefiting other people as a side product, they do benefit other people. New jobs are created, standards of living increase, even if people have to accept changes they didn't necessarily want. When people fear change and overvalue tradition to the point where they try to stop progress, the result is stagnation and ultimately decline. So that gives us two opposite scenarios. One where people throw themselves behind change and benefit, one where people try to keep everything the same and don't necessarily get the opportunity to grow. But in reality, the answer is probably going to be somewhere in the middle. There is a starker warning here as well, and I think this is also from the place where Schumpeter and Karl Marx meet. And that is what happens when consumers start to take innovation for granted. If consumers think that innovation is just the natural product or companies getting big and having money to invest in innovation, or if they assume that innovation and growth are the result of government intervention, they start to discount the risk that entrepreneurs take on, or the special genius that might be associated with somebody who manages to create something truly new. As soon as too much emphasis is placed on the government or very large companies, that whole cycle of success, death, and new life comes to an end. And that is better for no one. Economic growth is not just about new ideas, but it's about the economy being able to reallocate production to firms that have the best ideas. It's why invention and innovation are not the same. You have to be able to scale it and take it to market. So we don't just get to benefit from innovation. We have to systematize it. We have to invest in it. And we have to support it. We also have to support the people being affected by whatever example of creative destruction is playing out in the given moment. Because if we forget all of that, we have to remember that the alternative is stagnation and destructive revolution, as described by Karl Marx.